Duckface Killings is the fourth full-length album from Fulci, a Caserta, Italy-based band who play death metal, usually brutal death metal that is inspired by more of the meat and potatoes style. And they're a very straightforward band in that respect, but they've brought in their general theme is the films of Lucio Fulci, and what that does is that it allows them to bring in horror movie soundtrack work and incorporate it into their death metal. And I think it's on one level it is kind of kitsch, and there are a lot of 80s and 70s films and atmosphere to work into this that is very like classic Mortician and stuff like that. But they're really focusing on a film per album or a film per release, and they're making some interesting choices along the way. Some that are pretty obvious, like Zombie 2, and others that are not so obvious, like Voices from Beyond, which wasn't a very popular movie, but it has a lot of appeal in terms of how over the top it is, how cheesy it is, and how unique the story is in whatever disjointed way that it plays out on film. So if you're a fan of film and you're interested in death metal, it's an interesting pairing to get this to work, and they've done it. Sometimes they've done it better than others. Um, Tropical Sun was really their hit record. It was the big one. It was the one that hit the hardest. It was the kind of thing where they got it right. They got the vibe right. They got the right clips from the movie. They got soundtrack work in there too, and it all flowed with just enough interruption to keep your mind from glazing over, as they're pretty straightforward death metal attacked. Now, with Exhumed Information, they split the album in half, where the first half was all death metal, very straightforward, and the second half was all soundtrack work. And keep in mind, Fulci had like 3 songs at the end that were just long soundtrack covers, and I think there was a Fabio Frizzi cover that had guitars added, essentially. So it's interesting what this band has done, but they've made the jump to a bigger label. They've kind of toured a little bit more, they've seen the world a bit more, and now they're approaching a film based on the New York Ripper. So, what is that going to sound like? If you know the film, man, what is that going to sound like? So, check it out here. While my taste in Italian film probably lands closer to Fellini than it does Fulci, I do appreciate many of his films, and I think The New York Ripper is one that is completely disturbing. It is very much the sex and violence film of kind of that era, and as far as I'm concerned, it is horrifying. There's a lot of the requisite eye cutting. There's a lot of very brutal scenes that are quite over the top, and the way that it ends, it's very difficult to. I couldn't understand what had happened in the end of the movie. Because I was a little bit traumatized by it the first time I watched it back in the day. Now watching it, you see that it is gratuitous, but it is also a little bit sensitive in the way that it depicts things. There is a big shock to it. Anyway, I'm not here to I'm not qualified as a film critic in any sense, but I do appreciate the movie. So the way that they've conveyed those scenes into lyrics and death metal is to exaggerate what maybe doesn't need to be exaggerated and how brutal it is. And so it makes for a heightened sense of what this film's impact is, as a slightly confusing giallo or horror thriller movie with an investigation into a serial killer kind of leading the sort of narrative here, along with some very sexual moments, which are certainly disturbing in all cases. And so that's a pretty good fodder for classic death metal. And in the sense that Fulci bring a very classic Cannibal Corpse inspired approach to a lot of what they do, I would say the first, maybe the second and third Cannibal Corpse albums and the brutality that they brought for that time are a little bit of a barometer as to what to expect. The thing is, I really don't have that much to say about the riffs here. There's a little bit of bolt thrower in here. There's a little bit of kind of a jungle rot kind of a groove to some of these songs, and they go over pretty fast. There's a lot of them, and they touch upon some of the goriest points of the movie, and I think that's really fitting in terms of giving some tribute to it while remaining a death metal band obsessed with gore and brutality. There's a couple moments where it's like, man, why did you do that? Like bringing in Lord Goat from Gore-Tex and Nonfiction, it works. It certainly is hip hop and death metal mixing in a way that's reasonable, but I don't think that a lot of people are gonna love that. Maybe they will. You know, the crowd is different these days than it was in the mid '90s. The late '90s was maybe a little bit more into that combination. For me, it's not really what I expected in the tone of this general thing. But you know, I think the guy Lord Goat, he's certainly a fan of that kind of metal for sure, and also this kind of film. So I get it, and it makes sense. The film is set in New York, and that all lines up. But I don't know if you know, it's not really my thing. But it didn't bother me. I think the big criticism that I have here for this record is they don't really go like they're willing to mix hip hop into their sound in one song, and that stands out. But it stands out in such a way that you wonder why the rest of the album didn't go that far. Like why doesn't the 80s and late 70s soundtrack work make its way into their death metal? Where those things could combine in a more direct way rather than sitting next to each other. They've kind of proved that it could work on their Frizzy cover on Tropical Sun. So I thought, like, there's a step they didn't take here, but at the same time, there's a lot of steps that they took that made this a pretty memorable album. And it does come down to the fact that I don't know that this band has the riffs to really get me excited to come back to this record, but I liked the subject matter, the aesthetic, and all the things that they referenced that kind of got me to pay attention. So it's an appreciation for the craft of the album more than it is for the content and the substance of the album in my case. So while I do appreciate the audio visuals, the general theme and their connection to it, and I like the subject matter here, it won't stick with me. I wasn't that immersed in the actual content, and it's just an all right average death metal album when you cut away all the other things that make it unique. So I think that this is still on par with Tropical Sun. If you like that album, I think this is a great follow-up that directly it has a lot of parity in terms of quality, and maybe they've got a couple more riffs. They worked in some more classic old school stuff. Like I said, there's some bolt thrower type stuff in there too. So it works as a death metal listening experience, but it's not a timeless thing for me just yet. So solid record otherwise. I would recommend it. High recommendation to the general public. I think most people will pick this up and find something cool about it unless you're bothered by gore or whatever. But I think this is a solid album that is worth knowing and checking out if you're not familiar with the band. It's a great place to start. So check it out yourself. It came out on August 9th. And read my review for more of my thoughts in depth. Find the peace of mind.